Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're diving into the history of the ancient Jewish people, from their earliest days in the hills of Canaan to one of history's most transformative catastrophes. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. Get cozy, settle in, and let's begin. Picture the landscape of Canaan in the late second millennium, before the Common Era. Rolling hills covered in scrub and stone, valleys that blossom green after winter rains, then fade to brown under the relentless summer sun. This land, nestled between the great powers of Egypt to the south and the Hittite Empire to the north, was a corridor for trade, for armies, for ideas traveling between civilizations. And somewhere in these highlands, among shepherds and farmers, a people were emerging whose story would shape the world. The Late Bronze Age, spanning roughly from 1550 to 1200 BCE, was a time of unprecedented interconnection across the ancient Mediterranean world. Egyptian pharaohs exchanged letters with Babylonian kings, discussing diplomatic marriages and trade agreements. Merchant ships sailed between Cyprus, Egypt, and the Levantine coast, their holds filled with copper ingots, pottery, grain, and luxury goods. The famous Amarna letters, clay tablets discovered in Egypt, reveal a complex diplomatic network where even small Canaanite city-states corresponded with the Egyptian court, pledging loyalty or complaining about their neighbors. Canaan during this period was not a unified country, but a patchwork of small city-states, each controlling a walled town and surrounding agricultural villages. Places like Hazor, Megiddo, Giza, and Lachish were centers of power, their rulers vassals to Egypt, which had extended its influence northward after expelling the Hyksos invaders around 1550 BCE. Egyptian control varied, sometimes direct with governors and garrisons, sometimes indirect with local kings paying tribute and acknowledging Pharaoh's supremacy. But here's the fascinating puzzle that archaeologists and historians still debate today. We don't actually know where the ancient Israelites came from. There's no smoking gun, no clear archaeological moment where we can point and say, "Here, this is when they arrived." The question of Israelite origins remains one of the most contested topics in biblical archaeology, and the answers are far more complex than the simple narratives we might have learned in Sunday school. The earliest undisputed mention of Israel comes from an Egyptian monument called the Merneptah Stele, dated to around 1208 BCE. Pharaoh Merneptah, son of the famous Ramesses II, boasted of his military victories across Canaan. Among the cities and peoples he claimed to have defeated, one line reads, "Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more." Now, Egyptian royal inscriptions routinely exaggerated victories. Declaring enemies completely destroyed was standard propaganda, regardless of actual outcomes. But what matters here is the mention itself. The inscription uses a specific hieroglyphic marker, 3 seated figures, indicating a people rather than a city or place. This suggests that by 1208 BCE, there was a group in the highlands of Canaan known as Israel, distinct enough that the Egyptians took note of them. But who were these people? Where did they come from? The traditional biblical narrative describes a dramatic entry into Canaan, 40 years of desert wandering, followed by a military conquest under Joshua. Archaeology, however, tells a different story. When scholars excavate the supposed conquest cities, they find something unexpected. Many of the sites described as destroyed by the Israelites either didn't exist at the purported time or show no evidence of violent destruction. Jericho, famous for its falling walls, shows no evidence of significant occupation with walls during the late 13th century BCE, when the conquest would have occurred. Ai, whose name literally means the ruin, had been deserted for centuries before the Iron Age. So, if not military conquest, then what? Modern archaeology reveals a fascinating pattern. At the end of the Late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, the urban centers of Canaan were in decline. Egyptian control, which had dominated the region for centuries, was collapsing. The Great Bronze Age civilizations around the Mediterranean were experiencing what scholars call the Bronze Age collapse, a mysterious period when cities burned, trade networks fractured, and populations seemed to vanish or migrate. The causes of this collapse remain debated. Climate change may have played a role, with droughts affecting agricultural production. The appearance of the Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders who attacked Egypt and other kingdoms, contributed to the chaos. Internal social tensions within palace-based economies may have reached a breaking point. Whatever the causes, the effect was dramatic. By 1150 BCE, most of the Great Bronze Age centers lay in ruins or significantly reduced. Mycenaean Greece collapsed, the Hittite Empire disintegrated, Egyptian power retreated, the interconnected world system came apart. Into this vacuum, something new emerged in the highlands of Canaan. The hill country, which had been sparsely populated during the Late Bronze Age, suddenly saw an explosion of settlement. This wasn't happening in the fertile lowlands where the old Canaanite cities had stood, but in the more marginal terrain of the central highlands, the regions that would later be associated with the tribal territories of Ephraim, Manasseh, Benjamin, and Judah. Archaeological surveys of the hill country reveal a remarkable transformation, where the Late Bronze Age had seen perhaps 25 villages scattered across the highlands. By the early Iron Age, that number exploded to over 300 settlements. The population doubled, perhaps even tripled. These weren't grand cities with massive walls and palaces. They were small farming villages, often unwalled, with simple four-room houses, storage pits carved into bedrock, and terraced hillsides for growing olives and grapes. The material culture of these highland settlements is surprisingly simple. Pottery styles are limited, suggesting a subsistence economy focused on survival rather than wealth. There's an absence of imported goods, no luxury items, nothing to suggest connection to long-distance trade networks. The pottery itself shows clear continuity with Late Bronze Age Canaanite forms, but with a reduced repertoire. Where lowland sites show diverse pottery types, storage jars, cooking pots, serving vessels, fine ware for special occasions, the highland villages show just the basics needed for daily life. The houses in these early Iron Age villages follow what archaeologists call the four-room or pillared house plan. These structures typically had 3 or 4 parallel rooms, with one room often serving as a courtyard for animals and work. The design was practical for highland life. It could be built into sloping terrain, provided separate spaces for people and animals, and offered flexibility for extended families. The pillars that gave the house type its name were usually monolithic stones supporting the roof, creating a distinctively Israelite architectural form, appearing consistently across highland settlements. Water management was crucial. Unlike lowland cities that could access rivers or major springs, highland villages relied on rainfall collected in cisterns. Archaeological surveys have found numerous plastered cisterns carved into bedrock at these sites. The development of waterproof plaster made by mixing lime with ash was a technological breakthrough making permanent highland settlement possible. Without storing rainwater through dry summer months, these communities couldn't have survived. Agricultural terracing was another key innovation. The steep hillsides weren't naturally suitable for farming, but by building stone retaining walls and creating level planting surfaces, villagers could prevent soil erosion and create usable farmland. These terraces, still visible across the modern landscape, represent enormous labor investments. Every stone had to be gathered and placed by hand, but they transformed marginal land into productive olive groves and vineyards. And here's one of the most intriguing details archaeologists notice. Virtually no pig bones appear at these sites. In lowland Canaanite cities, pork was common. In Philistine sites along the coast, pig bones appear regularly, sometimes representing 10 to 20% of animal remains. But in these highland villages scholars associate with early Israel, pigs are conspicuously absent. At site after site, excavators find bones from sheep, goats, cattle, and occasionally wild game, but no pigs. Does this mean the people in these villages were practicing dietary laws that would later become central to Jewish identity? Perhaps. Or perhaps it was an adaptation to highland life, where pigs don't thrive as well as sheep and goats. The absence of pork doesn't prove identity, but it suggests cultural distinctiveness. So where did these highland settlers come from? Three main theories have dominated scholarly debate for decades. The first, the conquest model, follows the biblical narrative of military invasion. The second, the peaceful infiltration model, suggests nomadic groups gradually migrated into Canaan and settled. The third, currently most widely accepted among archaeologists, is the indigenous emergence model. This theory proposes the people who became Israel were already in Canaan. Pastoralists, displaced peasants, runaway servants, perhaps refugees from collapsing Bronze Age cities. As Egyptian control weakened and urban centers declined, these marginalized groups moved into sparsely populated highlands and formed new communities. Israel Finkelstein, one of the leading archaeologists working in Israel, has argued the early Israelites emerged from within Canaanite society itself. They weren't foreign invaders, but indigenous people who developed a distinct identity in the highlands. The material culture of these Iron Age villages develops directly from Late Bronze Age Canaanite culture. Pottery types, house structures, agricultural techniques all show continuity, not a sudden break indicating arrival of a foreign population. This doesn't mean the biblical narratives are entirely fabricated. Many scholars believe the texts preserve cultural memories, fragments of historical experience later woven into national origin stories. Perhaps some groups did come from outside Canaan. The biblical tradition of descent from Egypt might reflect the experience of Semitic workers or slaves who escaped Egyptian control and joined highland communities. Worship of a god named Yahweh, who in early texts is associated with regions south and east of Canaan, might indicate some people brought new religious ideas into the highlands. What we can say with confidence, by the beginning of the Iron Age, around 1200 BCE, a new society was taking shape in the hill country of Canaan. Whether they came from without or emerged from within, these people would eventually call themselves Israel. They lived in small villages, raised sheep and goats, planted olive trees on terraced hillsides, and stored grain in underground silos. They were not yet a nation, not yet a kingdom. They were tribes, loosely connected by kinship, shared territory, and common challenges of survival in the highlands. The land they inhabited was harsh, but could be fruitful. Winters brought rain that filled cisterns carved into limestone. Spring and summer demanded careful water management. The hills offered protection from lowland armies but made travel difficult. This was a landscape that shaped its people as much as they shaped it. And in these highlands, among scattered villages and pastoral camps, foundations were being laid for something that would endure long after great empires crumbled to dust. The early Iron Age in the highlands of Canaan was a time of small communities, each village largely autonomous, connected to neighbors through kinship and mutual defense, but without centralized political authority. This was the period that biblical tradition remembers as the time of the judges, those local leaders who arose in moments of crisis to rally groups of tribes against external threats. The Book of Judges paints a vivid, often brutal picture of this era. Stories of Deborah and Barak defeating Canaanite armies, of Gideon routing the Midianites, of Samson's violent exploits against the Philistines. These narratives, whatever their historical core, reflect a society that was decentralized, frequently under pressure from neighbors, and lacking the institutions we associate with statehood. There were no national borders, no standing army, no centralized bureaucracy. Leadership was charismatic and temporary, arising in response to specific threats and fading when the crisis passed. The social structure reflected in these stories is tribal rather than state-based. Identity came from membership in extended family groups, clans and tribes, rather than from citizenship in a kingdom. Land was held communally by these kinship groups rather than privately by individuals. Disputes were settled by elders rather than by royal judges. Religious practices were localized, with families and clans maintaining their own shrines and conducting their own sacrifices. This kind of social organization, which anthropologists sometimes call segmentary lineage system, is well documented in pre-state societies around the world. It's egalitarian in the sense that there's no permanent hierarchy, no kings or nobles whose status is inherited. But it's also potentially fragile when facing external threats, because coordinating action across multiple independent groups is difficult. Each clan, each tribe makes its own decisions. Collective action requires negotiation and consensus building, which takes time and may prove impossible when interests diverge. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of a loosely organized tribal society. The highland villages show no signs of centralized planning. Each community seems to have developed independently, choosing its own location based on access to water and arable land. There's no evidence of large public buildings, no palaces or administrative centers that would indicate hierarchical government. Instead, we find egalitarian settlements where households appear roughly equal in size and wealth. But during this period, something crucial was happening. These scattered communities were developing a sense of shared identity. Perhaps it began with common threats. The Philistines, newcomers who had settled along the coastal plain around the same time Israel was emerging in the highlands, represented a formidable military challenge. The Philistines were likely part of the Sea Peoples, those mysterious groups who attacked Egypt and other kingdoms during the Bronze Age collapse. After being repelled from Egypt by Pharaoh Ramesses III around 1175. BCE, according to Egyptian temple reliefs and inscriptions, some of these sea peoples settled along the southern Levantine coast. The Philistines established 5 main cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, each ruled by a lord, collectively forming what scholars call the Philistine Pentapolis. Archaeological evidence reveals that the Philistines brought with them a distinct material culture. Their pottery, especially in the earliest phase, shows clear connections to the Aegean world, with decorative styles reminiscent of Mycenaean pottery. They built their cities on a different plan than Canaanite sites, with different temple architecture and different administrative structures. They ate pork, unlike their highland neighbors. And crucially, they had advanced metallurgical knowledge. Unlike the Israelite villagers, the Philistines had access to advanced metallurgy. They could forge iron weapons and tools, giving them a significant technological advantage. The transition from bronze to iron for tools and weapons was occurring gradually across the ancient Near East during this period. But the Philistines seem to have controlled the technology more effectively in Canaan. Biblical traditions remember this period as a time when the Philistines controlled the iron trade, and Israelites had to go to Philistine smiths to sharpen their agricultural tools. One passage in 1 Samuel states, "Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, 'Otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears.' So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened." Whether historically accurate or not, this passage reflects a memory of Philistine technological superiority. The Philistine threat may have been the catalyst that pushed the highland tribes toward greater unity. Decentralized tribal organization worked well for managing agricultural life and defending against raids, but it was poorly suited to confronting a militarized enemy with superior technology. The biblical narrative suggests that the demand for a king arose precisely from this military pressure. The people wanted a leader who could organize them, maintain a standing army, and provide security against external enemies. The story of how this transition happened, from tribes to monarchy, is preserved in the first book of Samuel, though historians debate how much of this account reflects actual events versus later theological interpretation. According to the biblical text, the tribes gathered and demanded that the prophet Samuel appoint a king over them. Samuel warned them of the costs. A king would conscript their sons for his army, their daughters for his household, and demand taxes from their harvests. But the people insisted, "We want to be like other nations, with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles." Archaeological evidence for this transition period is frustratingly thin. The late 11th and early 10th centuries BCE, the time when the biblical narrative places the reigns of Saul and David, remain archaeologically murky. Some scholars argue this is because there wasn't much to find, that the early monarchy was small and poor, operating out of modest structures that have left little trace. Others contend that we simply haven't found the right sites yet, or haven't correctly interpreted what we've excavated. What we can observe is a gradual increase in settlement size and complexity during Iron Age too. Some villages begin to show signs of social stratification. A few houses become larger and contain storage facilities beyond what a single family would need, suggesting concentration of wealth or administrative functions. At some sites, archaeologists have found structures that might be public buildings or storage facilities, serving a wider community. This is the context in which the first Israelite king, Saul, supposedly emerged. The biblical account portrays Saul as a transitional figure, a charismatic military leader in the mold of the earlier judges, but with a more permanent position. He came from the tribe of Benjamin and made his headquarters at Gibeah, a site that archaeologists have tentatively identified with Tel el-Ful, north of Jerusalem. Excavations there have revealed a fortress from the early Iron Age, which some scholars cautiously associate with Saul's headquarters, though it's far more modest than the word palace might suggest, more like a fortified compound than a royal residence. Saul's reign, as depicted in the biblical texts, was troubled. He faced constant military pressure from the Philistines and eventually fell in battle on Mount Gilboa alongside his sons. But his most significant achievement may have been simply demonstrating that centralized leadership could work, that the tribes could be organized under a single authority. The kingdom he established was fragile and would not survive his death intact, but it proved the concept. The transition from Saul to David marks a crucial turning point, though one shrouded in legend and political propaganda. The biblical narrative presents David as a young shepherd who slew the Philistine champion Goliath, became a military hero in Saul's court, fled into the wilderness when Saul grew jealous, and eventually took the throne after Saul's death. Behind this dramatic story likely lies a more complex political reality. David appears to have been a military adventurer who built his own power base independent of Saul, gathering a band of followers described as malcontents and fugitives. He operated in the borderlands between Israelite territory and Philistine control, perhaps even serving as a Philistine vassal at times. When Saul fell, David was positioned to claim power, but it took time. He initially ruled only over Judah in the south from the city of Hebron, while Saul's surviving son Ishbosheth held the north. Only after years of civil war and Ishbosheth's assassination did the northern tribes accept David as king. This political union was far from inevitable. The northern tribes had little reason to follow a king from Judah, and the tensions between north and south would persist throughout Israelite history, eventually leading to the kingdom's permanent division. David's most consequential decision was his capture of Jerusalem. This was a bold strategic move. Jerusalem, a Jebusite city perched on a rocky spur between two valleys, was technically neutral territory, belonging to neither the northern nor southern tribes. The city occupied a naturally defensible position, with the Kidron Valley to the east and the Tyropoeon Valley to the west. Its location on the watershed between the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea put it at a strategic crossroads, though not on any major trade routes. The Jebusites, the Canaanite people who controlled Jerusalem before David, apparently felt quite secure behind their walls. According to 2 Samuel, when David approached the city, the Jebusites taunted him, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." It was a gesture of supreme confidence in their defenses. By conquering it and making it his capital, David created a political center that stood outside the traditional tribal territories, similar to how Washington, D.C. was established in neutral territory between northern and southern states. Jerusalem had no strong associations with any particular tribe. It hadn't been allotted to any group in the traditional division of the land. This made it ideal as a capital that could be seen as belonging to all Israel, rather than favoring one tribe over others. The exact method of Jerusalem's capture remains unclear. 2 Samuel mentions something about a water shaft or channel, leading to much speculation about David's men infiltrating through the city's water system. Jerusalem's water supply came from the Gihon Spring in the Kidron Valley, and archaeological evidence shows various tunnel systems connected to this spring, though their exact dates are debated. The biblical text itself is ambiguous. Different translations offer different interpretations of the obscure Hebrew terms. What we can say is that David took the city and made it his personal holding, what the texts call the City of David. Jerusalem in David's time was not the magnificent city of later memory. It was small, perhaps covering only 10 acres, and its population probably numbered in the low hundreds or thousands at most. The settlement occupied only the narrow ridge now called the City of David, a sliver of land between the valleys. But it had excellent defensive position, with steep valleys on three sides and access to a reliable spring. David apparently captured it through some kind of surprise attack involving the city's water system, though the details remain unclear. Once he held Jerusalem, he built it up as his personal stronghold, constructing what the Bible calls the City of David, on the narrow ridge south of what would later become the Temple Mount. David brought the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest that symbolized the presence of Israel's God, Yahweh, to Jerusalem. This move united political and religious authority in one place under the king's control. The procession bringing the ark to the city is described as a moment of great celebration, with David himself dancing before the ark, though his wife Michal, Saul's daughter, criticized this display as undignified for a king. The old tribal system, where leadership emerged organically and religious sites were scattered across the land, was giving way to a centralized monarchy with a royal capital and a state religion. This centralization would have profound consequences, both strengthening royal power and creating dependencies that would prove dangerous when that power was threatened. The establishment of Jerusalem as capital represented more than just a military or administrative decision. It marked the beginning of a new political order where power was concentrated in a royal court rather than dispersed among tribal elders. David brought the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest that symbolized the presence of Israel's God Yahweh, to Jerusalem. This move united political and religious authority in one place, under the king's control. The old tribal system, where leadership emerged organically and religious sites were scattered across the land, was giving way to a centralized monarchy with a royal capital and a state religion. But we must be cautious about accepting the biblical portrait of David's kingdom at face value. The texts that describe his reign were written centuries later by scribes working in Jerusalem, with every reason to glorify the city's founder and establish his dynasty's legitimacy. Recent archaeology has questioned the scale and power of David's kingdom. Some scholars, often called minimalists, argue that David, if he existed at all, was merely a local chieftain who ruled a small territory around Jerusalem, and that later writers inflated his importance for political and theological purposes. The discovery in 1993 of the Tel Dan Stele, an ancient inscription that most scholars read as mentioning the House of David, provided the first extra-biblical reference to David's dynasty. While a few scholars have proposed alternative readings of the damaged inscription, the majority interpretation supports a reference to the Davidic line. This confirms that David was a historical figure significant enough to found a remembered dynasty. But a historical David doesn't necessarily mean the biblical David in all his glory. The kingdom he founded may have been far smaller, poorer, and less impressive than tradition suggests. The archaeological footprint from the early 10th century BCE in the territories supposedly controlled by David is sparse. Monumental construction that we would expect from a powerful centralized state is largely absent, or at least hotly debated. Yet something significant was happening. The scattered highland villages were coalescing into a more unified political entity. Whether through military conquest, political alliances, or gradual integration, communities that had once been independent were acknowledging common leadership. The process was messy, incomplete, and contested, but it was real. By the end of David's reign, whether that reign was as glorious as later tradition claimed or far more modest, the groundwork had been laid for something that would be recognized as a kingdom, with Jerusalem at its heart. The transformation from tribal confederation to monarchy was not inevitable. Ancient Israel might have remained a loose alliance of highland communities, facing threats collectively, but maintaining local autonomy. That it developed centralized kingship, would have profound consequences, not just for its political history, but for its religious and cultural identity. Saul's kingship, as preserved in biblical tradition, was marked by tragedy. He was tall, impressive in appearance, initially successful in battle against Ammon, Moab, and the Philistines. The prophet Samuel anointed him, pouring oil on his head in the ancient ritual that marked divine selection. But Saul's relationship with Yahweh, mediated through Samuel, was troubled. The texts portray him as increasingly unstable, tormented by what they call an evil spirit from the Lord. consumed by jealousy of the young David's military successes and popularity. The psychological portrait of Saul in the biblical books is remarkably complex. He's presented as a man trapped between competing demands, the expectations of traditional tribal leadership versus the requirements of kingship, the will of God as interpreted by prophets versus practical military necessities. When he fails to completely destroy the Amalekites as commanded, when he presumes to offer sacrifice rather than waiting for Samuel, he loses divine favor. The text suggests that Yahweh regretted making Saul king, a theological statement that reflects deep ambivalence about monarchy itself. This ambivalence runs throughout the early biblical narratives of kingship. One strand of tradition sees the demand for a king as rejection of God's direct rule, a capitulation to the ways of foreign nations. Another strand presents kingship as divinely ordained, the fulfillment of promises made to the ancestors. These competing views likely reflect different theological perspectives in ancient Israel, perhaps stemming from different social groups, those who benefited from centralized power versus those who resented it. David's rise to power is presented as both divinely guided and politically shrewd. The famous story of David and Goliath positions him as Yahweh's champion, the unlikely youth who defeats the Philistine giant with a sling stone. But the subsequent narrative shows David as a skilled politician and military commander. He carefully builds his power base, winning loyalty from diverse groups. He maintains good relations with both Israelites and Philistines. When he becomes king, first over Judah and then over all Israel, it's through a combination of military success, political maneuvering, and strategic marriages. The biblical texts don't hide David's flaws. His affair with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband Uriah, his failure to control his sons, the rebellion of Absalom, the struggles over succession. These stories present a deeply human figure, capable of great courage and terrible sin. Whether these stories preserve accurate historical memories or represent later literary creations meant to explain later dynastic problems is debated. But they've given us one of the most complex portraits of leadership in ancient literature. Under David, Jerusalem became not just a political capital, but a religious center. The bringing of the ark to the city, accompanied by celebration and sacrifice, centralized worship in a way that had not existed before. Previously, worship of Yahweh had occurred at various local shrines throughout the tribal territories. Now the sacred symbol of God's presence resided in the king's city, under royal protection and presumably royal control. This fusion of political and religious authority would shape Jewish identity in ways that persisted even after the monarchy ended. The biblical tradition credits David with establishing administrative structures that would be developed more fully under Solomon. He organized a professional army, appointed officials to manage different aspects of governance, and established diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms. The friendship between David and King Hiram of Tyre, the Phoenician city-state to the north, is remembered as especially important. This relationship would provide crucial resources for the great building projects of Solomon's reign. But again, we must hold these traditions lightly, recognizing that our sources were written long after the events they describe, shaped by theological concerns and political agendas. The archaeological evidence for a powerful Davidic kingdom remains contested. Some sites traditionally associated with Solomon's building programs have been redated to later periods. The debate, often called the chronology controversy, has created deep divisions among scholars. Those who defend the traditional chronology, often called maximalists, argue that structures at sites like Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer date to the 10th century BCE and demonstrate the existence of a strong, centralized state. They point to architectural similarities, 6-chambered gates at all 3 sites, as evidence of unified royal planning. The Bible itself says that Solomon fortified these 3 cities, and here we have archaeological remains that seem to fit. Those who advocate for a revised, lower chronology, often associated with archaeologist Israel Finkelstein, argue that these structures should be dated to the 9th century BCE, during the time of the Omride dynasty in the Northern Kingdom. If this dating is correct, then the 10th century, the time of David and Solomon, shows far less evidence of centralized power, suggesting a much smaller, poorer kingdom than tradition claims. The debate is technical, involving careful analysis of pottery types, stratigraphy, and radiocarbon dating. But it matters because it affects how we understand the origins of the Israelite monarchy. Was there truly a golden age under David and Solomon, a brief moment when Israel was a regional power? Or is that image largely a later creation, projected backward to provide a glorious origin story for a people who experienced centuries of vulnerability and defeat? Whatever the archaeological reality, the biblical portrayal of David's reign establishes themes that will resonate throughout Jewish history. The chosen king, anointed by God, ruling from Jerusalem, establishing a dynasty that God promises will endure forever. When later prophets speak of a future ideal king, a Messiah who will restore Israel's fortunes, they consistently reach back to the figure of David. The hopes and dreams that would sustain Jewish identity through exile and dispersion find their anchor in this moment, in this king, in this city. David's importance lies not just in what he may or may not have accomplished historically, but in what he came to represent. The possibility of faithful leadership, the ideal of a king who, despite all flaws, had a heart turned toward God. Whether the historical David matched this ideal is perhaps less important than that the ideal itself took shape, providing a measuring stick against which all subsequent leaders would be judged and found wanting. Solomon's glory and the temple that changed everything. If David established the dynasty, it was his son Solomon who, according to biblical tradition, brought it to its height. The biblical portrayal of Solomon's reign presents an image of peace, prosperity, and unparalleled wisdom. The texts describe a kingdom extending from the Euphrates River to the border of Egypt, tribute flowing in from surrounding nations, wealth accumulating in Jerusalem. Solomon is remembered as the wise judge who could discern between competing claims to a child, the philosopher king who spoke proverbs and composed songs, the diplomatic genius who maintained peace through strategic marriages to foreign princesses. At the center of Solomon's achievements stands the temple. For 7 years, according to 1 Kings, workers labored to construct a house for Yahweh in Jerusalem. It was not a large building by ancient standards, only about 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. But it was richly decorated, its walls lined with cedar from Lebanon, its innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies, overlaid with gold. The temple was divided into 3 main sections: an entrance hall or porch called the Ulam, the main sanctuary or holy place called the Haikal, where priests performed daily rituals, and the inner sanctum or most holy place called the Davia, where the Ark of the Covenant was housed, accessible only to the high priest once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. This tripartite division was common in Levantine temple architecture of the period. Syrian and Phoenician temples excavated by archaeologists show similar layouts, suggesting that Solomon's temple followed established architectural traditions. The entrance was flanked by 2 massive bronze pillars, given the names Jachin and Boaz, whose exact purpose remains debated. Were they purely decorative, structural, or symbolic? The main hall contained an altar for burning incense, a table for the bread of the presence, and 10 golden lampstands. The walls were decorated with carved cherubim, palm trees, and flowers, all overlaid with gold. The floor was made of cypress wood, also gold-plated. The innermost sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, was a perfect cube, 30 feet in each dimension, completely dark, except when the high priest entered on that one day each year. Here sat the Ark of the Covenant, a gold-covered wooden chest containing the tablets of the law, flanked by 2 large cherubim carved from olive wood and overlaid with gold. These cherubim, described as having outstretched wings that touched each other, and the walls, created a throne for the invisible presence of Yahweh. In the courtyard before the temple stood the great bronze altar for burnt offerings and the enormous bronze basin called the Sea, supported by 12 bronze oxen arranged in groups of 3 facing the cardinal directions. This basin, which could hold thousands of gallons of water, was used for priestly ritual washings. The symbolism was profound. The sea represented the cosmic waters of creation, which God had mastered, and its placement in the temple courtyard suggested that God's house was the point where divine order was maintained against chaos. The construction of the temple represented more than an architectural achievement. It fundamentally transformed Israelite religion. Previously, worship of Yahweh had occurred at various local shrines and altars throughout the land. Now worship was centralized in Jerusalem, under the control and administration of the king and his appointed priests. This centralization had profound political implications. By controlling access to the deity, the king enhanced his power over the people. Religious pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the major festivals became mandatory, creating regular occasions when people from throughout the kingdom would come to the capital, reinforcing their connection to the central government. The temple also established Jerusalem as unique among Israelite cities. It was no longer just the political capital, but the sacred center, the place where heaven and earth met, where God's presence dwelt. This theological claim would prove remarkably resilient, surviving even the temple's destruction and continuing to shape Jewish identity into the present day. The biblical texts describe the temple's construction in remarkable detail: the types of wood and stone used, the dimensions of each section, the design of the cherubim that flanked the ark, the bronze pillars that stood at the entrance, the elaborate bronze basin called the Sea that held water for ritual washing. Some scholars see in these detailed descriptions evidence that the writers had access to actual temple records or architectural documents. Others argue that the descriptions reflect the Second Temple, built centuries later, or represent idealized visions rather than historical reality. Archaeological confirmation of Solomon's temple remains elusive. The site where it stood is now occupied by the Muslim holy sites of the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, making excavation impossible. We can't dig there to test the biblical descriptions. What we can do is compare the temple's described architecture with other known temples from the ancient Near East. And here the biblical description fits well with what we know of temple design in the Levant during the late 2nd and early 1st millennia BCE. The tripartite division, the entrance pillars, the inner sanctum all find parallels in Phoenician and Syrian temples. This suggests that even if we can't confirm the specifics, the general pattern is plausible for the period. Beyond the temple, Solomon is credited with extensive building projects throughout the kingdom. He fortified cities, built stables for his vast chariot forces, established store cities for grain and supplies, and constructed his own palace complex, which reportedly took 13 years to complete, almost twice as long as the temple itself. The biblical texts also describe Solomon's commercial ventures, a fleet of ships built with Phoenician help that brought gold, silver, ivory, and exotic goods from distant lands. The famous visit of the Queen of Sheba, who came to test his wisdom and departed, impressed by his wealth and knowledge. Yet the biblical account of Solomon's reign is not uniformly positive. As the narrative progresses, shadows appear. Solomon's 700 wives and 300 concubines, many of them foreign princesses married for diplomatic purposes, are said to have turned his heart away from exclusive worship of Yahweh. He built shrines for foreign gods to please his wives. He imposed heavy taxation and forced labor on his people to fund his building projects. He reorganized the kingdom into administrative districts that cut across traditional tribal boundaries, perhaps improving efficiency, but undermining tribal identity and loyalty. The texts hint at growing discontent during Solomon's reign. A prophet named Ahijah meets with one of Solomon's officials, a man named Jeroboam, and tells him that God will tear the kingdom away from Solomon's house and give 10 tribes to him. This prophecy sets in motion the division that will occur immediately after Solomon's death. The biblical writers see this division as divine judgment on Solomon's apostasy, his turning away from faithful worship of Yahweh. How much of the traditional picture of Solomon's reign is historical? The archaeological debate that surrounds David continues with even greater intensity regarding Solomon. If the monumental buildings at Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer are redated to the 9th century, then the 10th century, Solomon's time appears far less impressive. Some scholars argue that Solomon may have been a local ruler of a relatively small highland kingdom, and that the image of vast wealth and wisdom represents later royal propaganda, projecting the achievements of later kings backward onto a legendary founder. Others defend the essential historicity of a powerful Solomonic kingdom. They point to evidence of increased settlement and economic development in the 10th century, to the continuity of building traditions that suggest sustained state control, to Egyptian and Assyrian texts that refer to kingdoms in the Levant during this period. The debate continues, with new archaeological finds and refined dating techniques constantly adjusting our understanding. What seems clear is that by the end of the 10th century BCE, some form of centralized monarchy existed in the highlands of Canaan, centered on Jerusalem. Whether this kingdom was as vast and wealthy as the biblical texts claim, or far more modest in scope, it represented a significant political development. The tribal period was over. The Age of Kings had begun. And at the center of this new order stood the temple in Jerusalem, the house of God that would define Jewish worship and identity for centuries to come. Solomon's death marked the end of the united monarchy. His son Rehoboam would ascend to the throne in Jerusalem, but he would rule over only a fragment of his father's kingdom. The north would break away, establishing its own monarchy, its own capital, its own religious centers. The brief moment of unity was over. Division, which would weaken both kingdoms and ultimately contribute to their destruction, had begun. The split happened swiftly. When Solomon died, probably around 930 BCE based on chronological reconstructions, his son Rehoboam traveled to Shechem, an ancient site in the northern hill country, to be confirmed as king over all Israel. The northern tribes had specific grievances. Solomon's building projects had required heavy taxation and forced labor, burdens that fell especially hard on the north. Now they wanted relief. "Your father made our yoke heavy," they told Rehoboam. "Lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." Rehoboam consulted his advisors. The elders who had served his father counseled accommodation. If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants." But Rehoboam turned to his younger associates, who advised a harder line. When the northern representatives returned for his answer, Rehoboam declared, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips, but I will scourge you with scorpions." The response was immediate. "What share do we have in David?" the northerners cried. "We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, Israel!" They departed, rejecting Davidic rule. When Rehoboam sent his labor supervisor to deal with the situation, the northerners stoned him to death. Rehoboam fled back to Jerusalem. The kingdom split in two. The northern tribes, the larger and wealthier portion of Solomon's kingdom, formed the kingdom of Israel. They chose as their king Jeroboam, the same official whom the prophet Ahijah had promised would rule 10 tribes. The south, consisting primarily of the tribe of Judah along with the small tribe of Benjamin and the city of Jerusalem, became the kingdom of Judah, ruled by Rehoboam and the Davidic dynasty. This division was not merely political, it carried profound religious implications. Jerusalem and its temple remained in Judah, but most of the population now lived in the northern kingdom. Jeroboam faced a problem. If his subjects continued to go to Jerusalem for the major festivals, their loyalty might shift back to the Davidic king. Religious pilgrimage could become political subversion. So he established alternative worship centers within his own territory. He set up golden calves at 2 sites, Bethel in the south near the border with Judah, and Dan in the far north. "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem," he told his people. "Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." The choice of these locations was deliberate. Both were ancient sacred sites with long histories of worship. Bethel, in particular, had powerful associations. It was where Jacob had his dream of a ladder reaching to heaven, where he had set up a pillar and declared, "This is the house of God." The biblical writers, who were based in Jerusalem and loyal to the temple there, condemned Jeroboam's actions as the original sin that doomed the northern kingdom. The golden calves are portrayed as idols, a return to the apostasy of the golden calf at Mount Sinai. Every subsequent northern king is judged against Jeroboam, accused of walking in his sins and not departing from them. The formula, "he did evil in the eyes of the Lord," following the ways of Jeroboam and committing the same sin Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit, appears repeatedly in the biblical account of northern kings. But from a historical and religious perspective, the situation was more complex. The golden calves were probably not meant as idols of foreign gods, but as pedestals or thrones for Yahweh, similar to how the Ark in Jerusalem served as God's footstool. Ancient Near Eastern iconography commonly showed gods standing on the backs of animals. The bulls or calves would represent Yahweh's power and fertility-granting ability, not rival deities. Bethel and Dan were ancient sacred sites with long histories of worship. Jeroboam may have been attempting to revive traditional forms of worship that had existed before the centralization under David and Solomon, reclaiming a more ancient Israelite religious heritage that had been overshadowed by Jerusalem's recent rise to prominence. Nevertheless, the division created 2 separate religious trajectories. Judah maintained the temple, the Davidic dynasty, and Jerusalem's theological claims. Israel developed its own traditions, its own centers of worship, and a different understanding of leadership. Kingship in Israel was not dynastic in the same way it was in Judah. Where Judah would be ruled by an unbroken succession of Davidic kings for centuries, Israel experienced constant dynastic upheaval. Kings were made and unmade by military coups. Assassination was common. Stability was elusive. Yet for much of the divided monarchy period, The northern kingdom was the stronger and more prosperous of the two. It controlled more territory, had a larger population, and possessed better agricultural land. The Jezreel Valley in the north was one of the most fertile regions in the entire land. Israel also sat astride major trade routes, giving it economic advantages that Judah, tucked away in the highlands, did not enjoy. The capital of Israel moved several times before settling at Samaria. King Omri, who seized power in a coup around 880 BCE, founded Samaria on a hilltop he purchased, creating a royal city that didn't belong to any of the northern tribes, similar to David's strategy with Jerusalem. The choice of location was strategic. Samaria occupied a commanding hilltop with excellent visibility and defensive advantages, controlling important north-south routes through the central highlands. Omri and his son Ahab would build Samaria into an impressive city with fortifications and a palace complex. Archaeological excavations at Samaria have revealed excellent stonework, carved ivory decorations, and signs of wealth and administrative sophistication. The masonry is among the finest found anywhere in Iron Age Israel, with perfectly fitted ashlar blocks that required skilled craftsmen and significant resources. The palace compound occupied the summit of the hill, surrounded by a massive wall. Inside, excavators found numerous ivory fragments, furniture inlays, decorative panels, cosmetic boxes, carved with Egyptian, Phoenician, and Syrian motifs. These ivories, mentioned critically by the prophet Amos, testify to the wealth and international connections of the northern kingdom's elite. Omri and Ahab also established Israel as a significant regional power. Assyrian records from this period refer to Israel as the House of Omri, even long after Omri's dynasty had ended, showing how impressive his kingdom appeared to foreign observers. The black obelisk of Shalmaneser III depicts tribute being paid by Jehu, but the accompanying inscription still uses Omri's name to identify the kingdom, demonstrating the lasting impression the dynasty made. According to Assyrian records, Ahab fielded a substantial chariot force at the Battle of Karkar. The inscription credits him with 2,000 chariots, the largest chariot contribution of any ally in the coalition, though as with all ancient battle reports, such numbers may be exaggerated or rounded. The kingdoms of Israel and Damascus often fought each other, competing for control of the Transjordan and the trade routes that passed through it, but they could also unite against common threats like Assyrian expansion. However, the biblical narrative, written from a Judahite perspective, presents the Omride dynasty in overwhelmingly negative terms. Ahab's marriage to Jezebel, a Phoenician princess, brought foreign religious practices into Israel. Jezebel promoted worship of Baal, the Canaanite storm god, threatening the exclusive worship of Yahweh. The conflict between Elijah, the prophet championing Yahweh, and the royal couple supporting Baal worship is one of the most dramatic narratives in the biblical books. Elijah's contest with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, his pronouncement of drought as divine judgment, his flight into the wilderness and encounter with God. These stories depict the northern kingdom as teetering on the edge of religious apostasy. The religious tensions reflected deeper social and economic conflicts. The prophets who arose during this period, figures like Amos and Hosea, condemned not just idolatry, but social injustice. They railed against the wealthy who trample on the heads of the poor and deny justice to the oppressed. They accused Israel's rulers of corruption, of using their power to enrich themselves while ordinary people suffered. The economic prosperity visible in the archaeological record seems to have been concentrated in the hands of a small elite, while many remained poor. Relations between Israel and Judah fluctuated between hostility and cooperation. At times they warred against each other, At times, they allied against common enemies. Royal intermarriage created family connections between the two kingdoms. Jehoshaphat of Judah married his son to Athaliah, daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, cementing an alliance that would have devastating consequences when Athaliah later seized power in Jerusalem and nearly destroyed the Davidic line. Despite the political division, the two kingdoms maintained a sense of shared identity. They spoke the same language, worshipped the same God, even if in different places and ways, and traced their ancestry to the same patriarchs. The biblical texts, though favoring Judah and the Davidic dynasty, preserve traditions from both kingdoms, suggesting that cultural and religious exchange continued even when political relations were strained. But the division weakened both kingdoms. Separately, neither Israel nor Judah could match the military power of the great empires that dominated the ancient Near East. Egypt to the south had declined from its Bronze Age heights, but remained influential. More ominously, Assyria in Mesopotamia was rising, becoming the superpower that would reshape the entire region through conquest and deportation. The divided kingdoms, squabbling with each other and with neighbors like Damascus, Moab, and Ammon, were poorly positioned to resist when the Assyrian war machine turned its attention westward. The northern kingdom, larger and wealthier, would face Assyria first, and it would not survive the encounter. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, rising from its heartland in northern Mesopotamia, became the dominant military power of the 8th century BCE. Assyrian kings built their empire through systematic conquest, using superior military technology, brutal tactics, and a policy of mass deportation designed to break the spirit of conquered peoples. Iron weapons, siege engines, professional armies, excellent organization. Assyria had it all. And they had an ideology that drove them to expand. The god Ashur commanded them to bring order to the chaotic world, to subdue all peoples and make them tributaries. The Assyrian advance westward into the Levant was gradual, but inexorable. First came demands for tribute. Local kingdoms could maintain nominal independence if they paid, acknowledged Assyrian overlordship, and provided military support when required. Resistance, however, was met with overwhelming force. Assyrian armies would lay siege to cities, sometimes for months or years. When they finally broke through, the destruction was total. The Assyrians boasted of their brutality in inscriptions and palace reliefs. Mass executions, impalement of leaders, burning of cities, deportation of populations. The northern kingdom of Israel first appears in Assyrian records during the reign of Shalmaneser III in the mid-9th century BCE. At the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE, according to Assyrian inscriptions, Shalmaneser faced a coalition of Levantine kingdoms, and among them was a contingent from Israel, described as supplied by Ahab the Israelite. The inscription credits Ahab with contributing 2,000 chariots and 10,000 foot soldiers, impressive numbers that suggest a well-organized military, though like all ancient battle reports, these figures may be inflated. The coalition apparently fought the Assyrians to a standstill, though Shalmaneser's inscriptions naturally claimed total victory. For a few more decades, Israel and its neighbors could resist Assyrian domination through military alliances. But Assyrian pressure increased under Tiglath-Pileser III, who came to power in 745 BCE and reorganized the empire into a more efficient war machine. The kingdom of Damascus, often Israel's rival but sometimes its ally, fell to Assyria in 732 BCE. Tiglath-Pileser also struck at Israel itself, conquering the Galilee and the northern territories. The Assyrians deported populations from the captured regions, replacing them with people from other conquered lands. This first deportation removed the tribes living in the northernmost part of Israel: Dan, Asher, Naphtali, and portions of others. The Assyrian policy of deportation was calculated and systematic. By forcibly relocating conquered peoples, mixing populations from different regions, the Assyrians prevented united resistance. Deportees were settled in distant parts of the empire where they had no local support, no knowledge of the terrain, no ability to coordinate rebellion. They were surrounded by people who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, had different customs. The psychological impact was devastating. People torn from their ancestral lands, from the graves of their ancestors, from the familiar landscape that had defined their identity, were expected to adapt and survive in alien environments. The Assyrian kings documented these deportations meticulously. Inscriptions and administrative texts record the movements of populations across vast distances. People from Syria might be settled in Mesopotamia. Babylonians might be moved to the Levant. The empire became a mosaic of transplanted peoples, all dependent on Assyrian power for their survival, all too disoriented and scattered to mount effective resistance. Over time, these displaced populations would be absorbed into local cultures, losing their distinctive identity. The linguistic diversity of the Assyrian Empire meant that deportees, especially in the second generation, would often adopt Aramaic, the lingua franca of the empire, abandoning their native languages. Intermarriage with local populations was inevitable and probably encouraged by Assyrian authorities. Religious practices would blend as people adopted local cults alongside maintaining fragments of their own traditions. The Assyrians had discovered a way to not just conquer kingdoms, but to erase nations, to make conquest permanent by destroying the very identity of the conquered. King Hoshea of Israel, who had gained his throne through assassination and Assyrian support, initially paid tribute faithfully. But around 725 BCE, perhaps encouraged by promises of Egyptian support, he stopped the payments and declared independence. It was a fatal mistake. Shalmaneser V, the new Assyrian king, marched west with his army. He captured Hoshea and laid siege to Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom. The siege lasted 3 years. Samaria's hilltop location and strong fortifications made it difficult to conquer. The defenders held out desperately, but they were isolated, cut off from food and water. During the siege, Shalmaneser died and was succeeded by Sargon II, who completed the conquest. In 722 BCE, Samaria fell. Assyrian records describe what followed. Sargon's annals claim, "I besieged and conquered Samaria, led away as booty 27,290 inhabitants of it." Whether this number is exact or rounded, it represents a massive deportation. The Assyrians scattered these deportees across the empire, to Mesopotamia, to Media, to distant provinces where Hebrew-speaking Israelites would be surrounded by foreign populations speaking different languages, worshipping different gods. In their place, according to the biblical account in 2 Kings, the Assyrians brought settlers from Babylon, Cutha, Avva, Hamath, and Sepharvaim. These transplanted peoples brought their own gods and customs, and over time their descendants would blend with the remaining Israelite population to form what would later be called the Samaritans. The northern kingdom of Israel was finished. The capital was destroyed, the royal house exterminated, the administrative structure dismantled. The territory was reorganized as an Assyrian province. Assyrian governors ruled from Samaria, the kingdom that had existed for over 200 years, that had been stronger and wealthier than Judah, that had withstood threats from Damascus Egypt, and earlier Assyrian kings, was erased from the map. And with its destruction emerged one of history's great mysteries: the 10 lost tribes. The deported Israelites, scattered across the Assyrian Empire, vanish from history. Unlike the later Judean exiles in Babylon, who would maintain their identity and eventually return, the northern tribes assimilated and disappeared. Over the centuries, countless legends would arise about their fate. Some claimed they established kingdoms in distant lands. Others said they still existed somewhere beyond the Sambation River. Jewish apocalyptic literature promised their eventual return. Medieval travelers reported finding Jewish communities in Asia or Africa that might be descended from the lost tribes. In modern times, various groups from Ethiopia to India to the Americas have been identified as possible descendants. But historically, we can only say they were absorbed. The Assyrian deportation policy worked as intended. Israelites scattered to Mesopotamian cities, to villages in Media, to garrison towns throughout the empire, slowly lost their language, their customs, their identity. Some may have maintained Hebrew names or memory of their origins for a generation or two. But without a land, without a temple, without unified leadership, without even a common location to maintain group identity, they gradually became Assyrians, Babylonians, Medes. Their descendants still exist, certainly. Their genes are part of the heritage of millions of people across the Middle East. But as a distinct people called Israel, they ceased to exist. The fall of the northern kingdom had profound implications for the south. Refugees flooded into Judah, bringing with them traditions, texts, and religious practices from the north. Jerusalem's population swelled. Archaeological evidence shows a dramatic expansion of the city in the late 8th century BCE, with new neighborhoods built on the Western Hill. These refugees brought with them stories, laws, and theological perspectives that would be incorporated into what would eventually become the Hebrew Bible. Judah itself barely survived the Assyrian onslaught. In 701 BCE, after the kingdom of Israel had fallen, Assyrian king Sennacherib invaded Judah. He conquered city after city, deporting populations and destroying fortifications. His own annals claim he captured 46 fortified cities and countless villages, deporting over 200,000 people. The city of Lachish, Judah's second most important fortress, fell after a brutal siege, an event so significant that Sennacherib commissioned enormous wall reliefs depicting the conquest in his palace at Nineveh. Then Sennacherib turned to Jerusalem. He laid siege to the city, trapping King Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, as his inscription boasts. But Jerusalem did not fall. The biblical account attributes this to divine intervention. An angel struck down the Assyrian army, forcing Sennacherib to withdraw. The Assyrian records, while not mentioning any miraculous disaster, admit that Sennacherib did not capture Jerusalem, but accepted a heavy tribute and departed. Why Sennacherib failed to take Jerusalem when he had conquered so many other cities remains debated. Perhaps an outbreak of plague decimated his army. Perhaps news from Mesopotamia forced him to return home quickly. Perhaps the siege simply lasted longer than he could afford to maintain. Or perhaps, as the biblical account suggests, Hezekiah paid an enormous tribute that satisfied Assyrian demands without requiring conquest. Whatever the reason, Jerusalem survived while Samaria had not. This survival, while the north fell, would shape Judahite theology profoundly. Jerusalem had been spared while Samaria was destroyed. The temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem still stood while the northern shrines at Bethel and Dan were in ruins. The Davidic dynasty continued while the northern kings were dead. To the survivors, this suggested divine favor. Perhaps the north had fallen because of its religious sins, while Judah was spared because it maintained proper worship in the proper place. Such theological reflection, emerging from the trauma of Assyrian conquest, would influence how the biblical texts were written and how Jewish identity was understood. But Judah's survival was temporary. The Assyrian threat had been held at bay, but new powers were rising. And when they came, not even Jerusalem would be spared. As the northern kingdom staggered toward its destruction and Judah struggled to survive in its shadow, a remarkable phenomenon emerged: the classical prophets of Israel. These were not the earlier prophetic figures like Samuel or Elijah, who left no written records of their own words. The classical prophets, beginning with Amos and Hosea in the 8th century BCE, spoke messages that were preserved, edited, and collected into the books that bear their names. Their messages varied in detail but shared common themes: condemnation of social injustice, critique of empty religious ritual, warnings of coming judgment, and promises of eventual restoration. They spoke in vivid poetic language, employing metaphor and imagery to shake their audiences out of complacency. And they were profoundly unpopular, at least among those in power, because their message consistently challenged the status quo. Amos, a shepherd from Judah who prophesied in the northern kingdom during its last decades of prosperity, pronounced judgment on the wealthy elite. "They sell the innocent for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals," he declared. "They trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground and deny justice to the oppressed." He condemned those who lived in luxury while ignoring the suffering around them. "You lie on beds adorned with ivory and lounge on your couches. You dine on choice lambs and fattened calves. You strum away on your harps like David and improvise on musical instruments. You drink wine by the bowlful and use the finest lotions, but you do not grieve over the ruin of Joseph." Archaeological evidence supports Amos's critique. Excavations at Samaria have uncovered ivory fragments from furniture inlays, evidence of exactly the kind of luxury Amos condemned. These carved ivory pieces, showing Egyptian and Phoenician artistic influences, decorated the beds and walls of the wealthy. Meanwhile, surveys of rural sites show that many villagers lived in grinding poverty, their small houses containing only the most basic pottery and tools. The economic gap between rich and poor had become a chasm. Amos's message was clear: wealth gained through injustice would not protect them when judgment came. And judgment was coming, in the form of a foreign nation that would destroy Israel utterly. He didn't need to name Assyria explicitly. His audience would have understood the threat. But what made Amos's prophecy so disturbing was his insistence that this disaster wasn't random misfortune, but divine judgment. That Israel's God was bringing destruction because the people had violated the covenant, not through religious apostasy alone, but through social injustice. The poor were Yahweh's concern just as much as proper worship was. You couldn't sacrifice at the altar and oppress the widow, bring offerings while trampling the needy, and expect God's favor. Hosea, also prophesying in the north, used his own troubled marriage as a metaphor for Israel's relationship with God. Just as Hosea's wife had been unfaithful, so Israel had betrayed Yahweh by worshipping other gods. The covenant between God and people was portrayed as a marriage covenant, and Israel's apostasy as adultery. Yet even in pronouncing judgment, Hosea held out hope for restoration, for a future time when the relationship would be renewed and Israel would again be faithful. Isaiah, prophesying in Jerusalem during the same period, witnessed both the fall of the north and Sennacherib's invasion of Judah. His message combined sharp condemnation of Jerusalem's leadership with promises that the city would be protected. Your rulers are rebels, partners with thieves. They all love bribes and chase after gifts. They do not defend the cause of the fatherless. The widow's case does not come before them. Yet he also proclaimed that Jerusalem would survive the Assyrian siege, that Yahweh would protect Zion, his holy city. His vision of the remnant that would survive judgment, of a future king from David's line who would rule with justice and righteousness, provided both warning and hope. Isaiah's long career spanned the reigns of several kings of Judah. He counseled them on matters of war and peace, often advising against foreign alliances and military adventures. When King Ahaz faced threats from Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel, Isaiah told him to trust in God rather than appealing to Assyria for help. But Ahaz ignored the advice, setting in motion Judah's subordination to Assyrian power. Later, when Hezekiah considered rebelling against Assyria with Egyptian support, Isaiah again counseled against it, though his warnings were ultimately disregarded, leading to Sennacherib's devastating invasion. This created a theological tension that would have devastating consequences. Isaiah's message that Jerusalem would be spared reinforced the belief that the city was invulnerable, that God would never allow his temple to be destroyed. This belief, which came to be called Zion theology, would make it harder for later generations to accept that judgment could fall on Jerusalem itself. The idea that Yahweh had chosen Zion as his eternal dwelling place, that he was bound to protect it regardless of the people's behavior, became deeply embedded in Judahite consciousness. A century later, when Jeremiah proclaimed that the temple would be destroyed, he was nearly killed for contradicting this cherished belief. After Sennacherib's withdrawal and the survival of Jerusalem, Judah enjoyed a brief respite, but it was living on borrowed time. Assyrian power, which had seemed invincible, began to crumble in the late 7th century BCE. Internal problems, overextension, and attacks by Medes and Babylonians from the east weakened the empire. By 609 BCE, Assyria had fallen, its great capital Nineveh destroyed so thoroughly that later generations would barely remember where it had stood. But Judah's reprieve was short-lived. From the ruins of Assyrian domination, a new power emerged, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Under King Nabopolassar, and especially his son Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon rebuilt itself into the dominant force in Mesopotamia. In 605 BCE, Babylonian forces defeated Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish, establishing control over the entire Levant. Judah, like the other small kingdoms of the region, became a Babylonian vassal. During this dangerous period, the prophet Jeremiah appeared in Jerusalem with a message that shocked and angered his audience. He proclaimed that Judah's survival depended on submitting to Babylon, that resistance would lead to destruction. This is what the Lord says: if you stay in this city, you will die by the sword, famine, or plague. But if you go out and surrender to the Babylonians, you will live. Such a message in a time of nationalist fervor was seen as treason. Jeremiah was beaten, imprisoned, thrown into a cistern, and constantly threatened with death. Other prophets and priests contradicted Jeremiah, assuring the people that God would protect Jerusalem as he had protected it from Sennacherib. They promised peace when there was no peace, declaring that the temple's presence guaranteed the city's safety. The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, they chanted, as if the sacred building's existence were a magical charm against disaster. But Jeremiah insisted otherwise. He proclaimed that the temple would be destroyed as the northern sanctuary at Shiloh had been destroyed centuries before. He declared that the covenant between God and people had been broken, that Judah's sins, idolatry, injustice, violence, had made judgment inevitable. Only repentance might avert catastrophe, and such repentance was not forthcoming. Jeremiah's career as a prophet was marked by consistent rejection and suffering. He was forbidden to marry or have children, living as a sign of the coming disaster. He performed symbolic actions, breaking a clay jar to represent Jerusalem's coming destruction, wearing a yoke to symbolize Babylonian domination, that outraged his opponents. He was beaten by a priest named Pashhur and put in stocks. He was arrested and imprisoned in a cistern, where he sank into mud and would have died if a sympathetic official hadn't intervened. Throughout it all, he maintained his unpopular message. Surrender to Babylon was the only way to survive. His personal writings, preserved in the book bearing his name, reveal a man torn between his calling and his desires. He complained to God about his fate, wished he had never been born, accused God of deceiving him. Yet he couldn't stop prophesying, couldn't abandon the message that burned within him, like fire shut up in his bones. His suffering and persistence would make him a model for later Jewish and Christian understandings of the prophetic vocation. The lonely figure speaking truth to power, rejected by his contemporaries but ultimately vindicated by events. King Jehoiakim, who ruled Judah as a Babylonian vassal, rebelled in 601 BCE. After Babylon suffered a setback against Egypt, it was a disastrous decision. Nebuchadnezzar marched west in 597 BCE and besieged Jerusalem. During the siege, Jehoiakim died. Whether from natural causes, assassination, or death in battle is unclear. His young son, Jehoiachin, only 18 years old, inherited the throne and the siege. After 3 months, he surrendered. Nebuchadnezzar did not destroy Jerusalem at this time. Instead, he stripped it of treasures and people. He looted the temple and the royal palace, taking precious metals and sacred objects back to Babylon. More significantly, he deported the king, the royal family, the nobility, the skilled craftsmen, perhaps 10,000 people in all, to Babylon. This first deportation removed the elite of Judean society, the people with education, resources, and leadership skills. They would spend the rest of their lives in exile. Nebuchadnezzar appointed Jehoiachin's uncle, Zedekiah, as a puppet king over what remained of Judah. It was a test of Judean loyalty, and Judah failed. Despite Jeremiah's warnings, despite the clear example of what happened when kingdoms rebelled against Babylon, Zedekiah also revolted. Perhaps he was encouraged by Egyptian promises of support. Perhaps nationalist sentiment made submission politically impossible. Perhaps he genuinely believed, against all evidence, that God would protect Jerusalem. In 589 BCE, the Babylonian army returned. This time there would be no mercy. The final siege of Jerusalem was a nightmare that lasted over 2 years. The Babylonians built siege works around the entire city, cutting off food supplies and preventing escape. Massive earthen ramps were constructed against the walls, allowing siege engines to be brought close enough to batter the fortifications. Archaeological excavations have found arrowheads and evidence of burning from this period, silent testimony to the violence. Inside the walls, famine grew increasingly severe. The Book of Lamentations, written by survivors of the siege, describes the horror in graphic detail. Those killed by the sword are better off than those who die of famine. Racked with hunger, they waste away for lack of food from the field. Women were reduced to eating their own children. The wealthy, who had always had enough, now competed for scraps. Water became precious as Babylonian control of the springs outside the walls forced Jerusalem to rely entirely on cisterns. People ate whatever they could find: leaves, leather, even dirt. Parents watched their children starve, unable to help. The wealthy and powerful suffered alongside the poor. Disease spread through the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. As conditions worsened, desperation grew. But the city held on, hoping against hope for relief that never came. Some must have wondered why God did not intervene as he supposedly had during Sennacherib's siege a century earlier. Where was the destroying angel now? Where was the miraculous deliverance? In the summer of 586 BCE, in the fourth month by the Jewish calendar, the month of Tammuz, the walls were finally breached. Scholars debate whether this occurred in 587 or 586 BCE, due to different ways of calculating regnal years, but the event itself is well documented in both biblical and Babylonian sources. After more than 2 years of siege, the Babylonian battering rams and sappers had done their work. Sections of the fortification collapsed or were broken through. Babylonian soldiers poured through the gaps. The slaughter that followed must have been terrible. Desperate defenders, weakened by starvation, could offer little effective resistance to professional soldiers. Civilians tried to flee, hide, or surrender. Chaos reigned as the city that had withstood so many threats finally fell. King Zedekiah attempted to flee with some of his army, escaping at night through a gate between the walls. But Babylonian forces pursued and captured him in the plains near Jericho. He was brought before Nebuchadnezzar at the Babylonian headquarters in Riblah, Syria. There, in a final act of cruelty, Zedekiah was forced to watch as his sons were executed before his eyes. Then his eyes were put out. Blind and broken, he was dragged in chains to Babylon, where he would die in prison. Jerusalem's fate was sealed. About a month after the breach, Nebuchadnezzar's commander, Nebuzaradan, entered the city with orders to complete its destruction. He burned the temple, reducing Solomon's magnificent structure to rubble. He burned the royal palace and all the houses of the prominent citizens. He tore down the walls, dismantling the fortifications that had protected Jerusalem for centuries. Anything of value was taken as plunder. The bronze pillars that had stood at the temple's entrance, the great bronze basin called the Sea, the smaller bronze stands, all were broken up and hauled to Babylon as scrap metal. More people were deported in this second wave. The biblical books give different numbers. 2 Kings mentions most of the remaining population, while Jeremiah 52:29 specifies 832 people from this particular deportation, creating scholarly debate about whether this refers to family heads or represents one of multiple deportations. Archaeological evidence suggests Jerusalem's population was already significantly reduced from what it had been before 597 BCE. Many had likely fled to the countryside or to Egypt during the final siege. Those who remained, priests, surviving officials, skilled workers, were now taken to Babylon. Only the very poorest were left behind to work the land as tenant farmers under Babylonian-appointed governors. The kingdom of Judah ceased to exist. The Davidic dynasty, which had ruled for over 400 years, which God had supposedly promised would endure forever, was finished. The temple, the house of Yahweh, the sacred center that guaranteed divine presence, lay in ruins. The capital city that prophets had declared inviolable was a burned-out shell. Everything that had defined Jewish identity, land, kingship, temple, was gone. This should have been the end. Throughout the ancient Near East, when kingdoms fell and temples were destroyed, the gods of those kingdoms were considered defeated. Conquered peoples typically either adopted the gods of their conquerors or simply disappeared as distinct communities. The Assyrian destruction of the northern kingdom had resulted in the loss of the 10 tribes. By all historical precedent, the Babylonian destruction of Judah should have produced the same outcome. The Jews should have vanished into history, assimilated into Babylonian society, their God forgotten, their identity erased. But something remarkable happened instead. In Babylon, among the exiles, Jewish identity not only survived, but was fundamentally transformed and strengthened. The experience of exile, traumatic as it was, became the crucible in which Judaism, as we know it, was forged. Several factors contributed to this survival. First, the exiled community was not scattered randomly across the empire as the northern tribes had been. The Judeans were settled in specific locations in Babylon, primarily along the Shebar Canal system in southern Mesopotamia. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests they lived in distinct communities, perhaps even entire villages of deportees. This geographic concentration allowed them to maintain community. They could live near each other, marry among themselves, and preserve their language and customs. The prophet Ezekiel, who was among the exiles, describes gathering with the elders of Judah in Babylon, suggesting organized community structures. Life in Babylon for the exiles was not uniformly terrible. They weren't enslaved in the sense of being owned as property. Rather, they seem to have been integrated into Babylonian society as a resettled population with certain obligations, but also certain rights. Some adapted quite successfully to Babylonian life. Cuneiform tablets from Babylon mention Jews by name engaging in commerce, owning property, and participating in legal transactions. Some rose to positions of relative prominence in Babylonian administration. Yet, they remained distinct. They maintained their language, speaking Hebrew even as they learned Aramaic and Akkadian for daily commerce. They kept their customs, observing the Sabbath and other distinctive practices that set them apart from their neighbors. They told stories about their ancestors, preserved memories of Jerusalem and the temple, and nurtured hopes of eventual return. Second, the exiled community included Judah's elite, the educated, the literate, the priests and scribes who knew the traditions and laws. These were not illiterate peasants who might quickly forget their heritage. They were the people most invested in maintaining their identity and most capable of doing so through writing and teaching. The priests, deprived of the temple where they had performed their sacred duties, turned to other forms of religious preservation, teaching, writing, organizing community worship in new forms. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the exilic period saw an extraordinary burst of literary and theological creativity. The priests and scribes in Babylon began to collect, edit, and compose texts that would preserve Jewish memory and law. Much of what would become the Hebrew Bible was written or reached its final form during this period. The Torah, the historical books, the prophetic collections, all were shaped by people reflecting on how catastrophe had occurred and what it meant for the future. The theological challenge was profound. How could God have allowed his temple to be destroyed, his city conquered, his people exiled? Earlier prophets like Jeremiah had provided an answer. This was divine judgment for sin. But that raised another question. Had God abandoned his people forever? Was the covenant truly broken beyond repair? The exilic prophets wrestled with these questions. Ezekiel, who had been taken to Babylon in the first deportation of 597 BCE, received visions of God's presence among the exiles. God was not confined to Jerusalem or the temple. He could be encountered in Babylon. The vision of the Valley of Dry Bones, which Ezekiel saw reassembled and brought to life, offered hope that the nation could be restored, even from death. Second Isaiah, the anonymous prophet whose work appears in chapters 40 through 55, of the book of Isaiah proclaimed that the exile would end, that Yahweh would lead his people home in a new exodus. "Comfort, comfort my people," this prophet began. "Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for." These texts promise not just return, but transformation. The experience of exile, terrible as it was, could lead to purification and renewal. The exilic community also developed new forms of religious practice that didn't depend on the temple. Without sacrifices, without a priesthood performing daily rituals, how could they maintain their relationship with God? Many scholars believe this period saw the origins of what would eventually become the synagogue, not as a replacement for the temple, but as a gathering place for prayer, study, and community. Though direct archaeological evidence for formal synagogue buildings doesn't appear until later periods. What seems clear is that sacred time became more important than sacred space. Sabbath observance, circumcision, dietary laws, practices that could be maintained anywhere, that marked Jewish identity without requiring a temple, became central to communal life. The experience of exile also deepened monotheism. Earlier Israelite religion had acknowledged the existence of other gods, while insisting that Yahweh alone should be worshipped by Israel. But the exile raised a more fundamental question. If other gods existed, why had they allowed their peoples to prosper while Yahweh's people suffered? The answer that emerged was increasingly clear. There were no other gods. Yahweh alone was truly God, creator of heaven and earth, ruler over all nations. Babylon's gods were powerless, mere idols of wood and stone. This strict monotheism, which would become central to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, crystallized during the exile. The Babylonian period lasted until 539 BCE, when the Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon. Cyrus had a different policy toward conquered peoples than the Assyrians and Babylonians. Rather than deporting populations and suppressing local traditions, he encouraged people to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples, as long as they acknowledged Persian overlordship and paid taxes. This policy wasn't purely benevolent. It was smart imperial administration. Satisfied subjects were more reliable than resentful ones. By allowing local customs and religions to flourish under Persian protection, Cyrus created a more stable empire. In 538 BCE, Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to Judah and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. The edict is preserved in the biblical book of Ezra. While the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document now in the British Museum, doesn't mention the Jews specifically, it does describe the king's general policy of restoring temples and allowing displaced peoples to return to their homelands throughout his empire, lending credibility to the biblical account of his decree regarding Jerusalem. Not all the exiles returned. Many had established lives in Babylon with homes, businesses, and families. They had been born there, their children had grown up there, and for some, Babylon was the only home they knew. Why leave prosperity and familiarity to travel hundreds of miles across desert and mountains to a ruined city in a poor province? Babylon's Jewish community would continue to thrive for centuries, eventually producing the Babylonian Talmud, one of the foundational texts of rabbinic Judaism. But some did return, bringing with them the texts they had preserved and the vision they had developed. They would rebuild Jerusalem's walls under Nehemiah's leadership. They would reconstruct the temple under Zerubbabel, though this second temple was far humbler than Solomon's had been. They would establish a community centered on Torah, on law and scripture, rather than on kingship. The returning exiles brought with them the Sabbath as a central institution, enhanced emphasis on circumcision as an identity marker, stricter separation from intermarriage with surrounding peoples, and a growing body of written texts that defined proper worship and behavior. They also brought new ideas that may have been absorbed during their time in Babylon, though the exact mechanisms of cultural influence are difficult to trace. The concept of angels as distinct beings with personal names and hierarchical organization becomes more prominent in post-exilic Jewish texts. Books like Daniel and Ezekiel show elaborate angelic hierarchies that some scholars see as influenced by Persian or Mesopotamian angelology. Ideas about resurrection and afterlife, barely present in earlier Israelite texts, begin to appear more clearly in later biblical books and become central in some Second Temple period literature. Satan emerges as a more distinct figure in post-exilic texts like Job and Zechariah, developing from a common noun meaning adversary into something closer to a supernatural being, though still far from the later fully developed concept. The Second Temple would stand for 500 years, outlasting Persian, Greek, and Roman rule, until its destruction in 70 CE by the Romans. But even that second destruction would not end Judaism, because the transformation that occurred during the Babylonian exile had made Jewish identity portable. It no longer depended on having a land or a temple. It could exist anywhere, sustained by texts, practices, and memory. The rabbis who would lead Judaism after 70 CE essentially followed the pattern established during the Babylonian exile. They created institutions, the synagogue, the academy, the legal system based on written and oral Torah, that could function without a temple, without sacrifices, without a political state. They made study itself a form of worship, transformed prayer into a substitute for sacrifice, and turned the text into a portable homeland. The story that began with scattered highland villages in Late Bronze Age Canaan that passed through tribal confederation, united monarchy, divided kingdoms, Assyrian conquest, and Babylonian destruction did not end with that destruction. In some ways, it was just beginning. The people who emerged from exile were not simply the remnant of an ancient kingdom. They were a new kind of community, defined not by political power, but by religious commitment. Not by territorial control, but by textual study. Not by temple sacrifices, but by prayer and ethical living. The exile taught them that God's presence wasn't confined to one place, that worship could occur anywhere, that identity didn't require political sovereignty. These lessons would prove invaluable across subsequent millennia of dispersion. Whether in Babylon or Alexandria, in medieval Spain or Poland, in modern New York or Tel Aviv, Jewish communities would maintain their distinctiveness through precisely those mechanisms developed during the exile: sacred texts, regular communal prayer, distinctive practices, and memory of a shared past. They had lost everything: land, temple, kingdom, and survived. They had been tested in the crucible of exile and emerged with an identity that could endure not just decades, but millennia. The kingdom had fallen, yes, but the faith that emerged from its ashes would prove more resilient than any kingdom. And the story of this people, preserved in the texts they wrote and rewrote in Babylon, would go on to shape the entire world through Judaism itself and through Christianity and Islam, both of which drew deeply from these ancient wellsprings. Thank you so very much indeed for joining me tonight on this remarkable journey through time. If you enjoyed this exploration of ancient history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me continue creating these deep dives into the past. Until next time, sleep well and dream of ancient hills.